Good evening, everyone. I am David Mandel with OHEL Children's Home and Family Services, and welcome to OHEL's TheraZoom program this evening. This evening is titled Beyond the Tears, Anticipating the Anniversary of Loss. Today, March 2nd, marks the one-year anniversary of the first individual diagnosed with COVID in New York State. That individual is a gentleman who lives in Riverdale, and he and his wife, Lawrence Gabuz and Adina Lewis Gabuz, were profiled today in the Wall Street Journal on the one-year anniversary. We specifically prepared this evening to speak to all of you who joined us this evening and the many who will hear about it through OHEL's TheraZoom platform on the anniversary of this 1 year where so many individuals, 500,000 throughout the United States, have unfortunately lost their life. And for those individuals who signed on this evening, in some way have a direct connection to a loss, to grief. It may be a family member. It may be a more distant relative. It may be a neighbor, a friend, a colleague. But all of us this evening understand that this past year has brought about a profound change in our lives, and for many people, a very specific and tragic loss. Our two speakers this evening are going to address this issue directly. First, OHEL's TheraZoom is the platform since March of 2020, 1 year ago, that we have established to speak to you, all of you listening this evening, and literally the thousands upon thousands throughout the New York region, the United States, overseas from here to Australia, that have tuned in to our weekly conversations on grief, on missing celebrations, on losing one's job, on responding to COVID in many different ways, on our children learning at home and the effects on children and our anxiety. So many different conversations. Tonight, Sarah Rivka Cohn will address the issue of the 1 year anniversary and its impact on children. Excuse me. Sarah Rivka Cohn lost her mother when she was 9 years old. In April of 2006, she founded Links to support children and teens who had lost a parent. The organization serves families in the US, Canada, Europe, and English speakers in Israel. Following Sarah Rivka Cohn, we will be addressed by Dr. Norman Blumenthal, whom I will introduce after Sarah Rivka is speaking. OHEL's Partners in Resilience are very proud to be joined this evening and co-sponsored by Links, Sarah Rivka Cohn, the founder. Sarah Rivka, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening.
The pleasure is all mine. The honor is mine, and thank you for having me on here tonight. So what we're going to do tonight, hopefully, is explore a little bit about the experience of what an anniversary of death, a yahrzeit, may look like for a child or teen who is grieving. I know there were many questions that were sent in, many very emotional questions, very telling of the experience that so many of us have had throughout this year, losing friends, losing family members, and there's a lot going on for children and teens. So I'm going to share a little bit of a presentation, and I'll also be taking some of the questions and answers at the end. Bear with me a moment, and here we go. Okay, so first, as David introduced me, I really appreciated that introduction. Both on a personal level, I've experienced grief as a child who lost her mother at the age of 9. I founded Links in 2006 to service children who've lost a parent. Since then, I've gotten to meet and interact with hundreds and, dare I say, thousands of children and teens over the years. Our 3 divisions, Links Schleimies Club, which is our boys division, and Little Links of Pearls, which is our elementary school girls division, host events, therapy referrals, retreats, publications, support groups, and case management. And we've gotten to hear from the kids and the teens a lot about their grief experience, and I'll be using that in this presentation. The first thing that I think we want to acknowledge is that if you put into Google, face of a grieving child, these were the top 4 images that came up for me. And I always start my presentations with this because I think this is fundamental. We have an idea of what a grieving child will look like, whether it's on the yard site, on the death of the anniversary, or throughout the year, right? There's this sad, head in hands, kind of lonesome look. And truth be told, some children look that way, some children certainly feel that way, and sometimes it's a little different. And for privacy purposes, I couldn't use anyone else's images, so I could take from my own childhood. These 3 pictures of myself looking pretty happy, I'd say. The one where I'm eating the donut is only 3 months after my mother passed away. And the one where I'm in this little dress in the corner is where my mother had actually been in a coma at that time. And the other one is at an 8th grade graduation. And what I want you to see is that for a lot of us, there's this expectation that come yard site, come the anniversary of death, I'm going to be this sad wreck. I'm going to expect the children to be this way, grandchildren to be this way. And sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. And both are okay. And I don't want anyone to walk out of here and think that there's any one way to grieve on a personal level or for their child or grandchild. So just have that in mind. You know, I put this up on social media and I got a lot of reaction to it, where I said yard site can be defined as the anniversary of a loved one's death, but it's also known to grievers as the most confusing day of the year. So many unmet expectations, expectations to feel, expectations of how the family will be reacting, celebrating, or doing anything in any particular way. Lots of I should be's, right, without the ability to fulfill that should. And you know, I think that we create expectations sometimes in our mind, particularly when there's a first anniversary and we say, this is what I should be feeling. This is what I should be doing. And what I think we need to be mindful of is that we need to come at it with an open mind. We need to know that some years it will be emotional, some years it won't be. And that doesn't mean that one year is better than the next in either direction. So having those expectations sometimes puts a pressure on a child or a teen where they feel like everyone's looking at them and expecting me to be a certain way, whether it's while visiting a grave, whether it's while sitting around at a meal with a family that's recounting stories about the person who passed away. And they may be feeling this expectation. You know, sometimes in school, teachers will approach a student and say, I know you're having the yard site, you must be feeling X. And I often will suggest to friends, family, teachers, say, ask them, get curious about their experience. Say, I know you have yard site coming up. You know, what are your plans? What would you like to do? What are you feeling? Don't make the assumption of you must be XYZ. Okay. I like to get a little practical here because a lot of the questions that came in through when I posted about this flyer on social media about this event, there was a lot of questions of like, okay, pragmatically, if there's a family with young children or grandchildren grieving, what can we do? And I think that a lot of this is structured around the family, but I think that there was a good point made that there were many who lost close neighbors or friends or other people. And I want you to be able to feel free to adapt this in any way that works for you or your family. So the first thing is I have this little plan strategy, which I use for yard site for myself. And I think it's been helpful to others, which is a lot of us have the fear of the unknown. It's like, what's this day going to look like for me? What's going to happen? I'm really nervous. Now, particularly when it's a first yard site, that's when it's a first anniversary of that, that's like exponentially the biggest piece, right? A lot of us feel like, okay, what's going to happen? How are we going to feel about this, right? There's a lot of those fears. So, in order to help a child deal with it, I actually will write out this word plan exactly as you see it. P stands for plan for it. And I always say, let's sit down as a family if we can, or individually with each child and say, let's plan this day, right? What are we going to be doing first, second, third? And sometimes there are just realistic um, physical pieces that need to be put into place, right? We're going to be going to grandma's house and we're going to be eating a meal over there. We're going to be then going to the grave site. We're going to be doing, right? There are things that we're going to do as a family. But sometimes it's just there's a lot of loose hours through the day or a lot of loose pieces, or maybe a child's going to school and wants to know, like, what am I supposed to feel or do while I'm in school on this day? We want to plan. The more we plan for ourselves, for children, it just gives them a sense of security. Then L, help them label their needs, right? You want to label the needs. What are your needs for the day? Physically, sometimes children and teens really want space and they want to be able to be on their own, right? Sometimes children want to always be with supportive adults around them. Sometimes children want to do something creative. Let them label a little bit of their needs. And if you need to help them by giving them some options, that's fine too. Ask for help to make it happen. I always tell children and teens, you need to ask the adults around you for help to make it happen. But if you are the adult, you want to offer help to make it happen. So, for instance, I have quite a few teens who say they wish that when the family goes to a grave, and they all go together, and sometimes there's extended family, and they really like that for some of them. And some of them feel like, I really would love a couple minutes alone with this deceased um, person so that I can talk to them and share what's going on for me. And as the adult in the picture, if you can make that happen for the child, that could be so helpful and so cathartic. And we need to prepare children for the fact that as much as we're going to plan and we're going to label and we're going to try to offer as much help as we can to make it happen, not all will go as planned. Um, Expectations, find a place for these children to be the day of. And I don't mean a physical place, although that can always also be a piece of it. But it's more about what's their position in the day. Sometimes it's surrounded around adults, whether it's saying the Kaddish prayer, whether it's going to a particular event that's sponsored in memory of a loved one or whatever it is, right? And sometimes we forget to kind of have an expectation of what's the position this child will be taking through the day. Offer as many options as you can. Not always are there options, but wherever you can, giving the child the freedom to be able to choose um, can be a huge, huge piece. Um, Sometimes we have expectations that we want to feel close to the deceased on the day of the anniversary. If this was someone you particularly had a really good relationship with, then there's this feeling of, like, again, an expectation of, I should be feeling close to them. I should be feeling sad. I should be feeling, and I just want to encourage you again to put this out there for children and teens to allow them to know that, what, you may feel that way and you may not. And it says nothing about you or the relationship that you had with the deceased if you do or don't have those feelings. There may be some social anxiety that plays out, particularly for boys who may be davening in yeshiva and they may be davening as the chazan that day, as the one who leads the prayers. You want to be cognizant of that and just watch for it. Watch if there's hesitation, offer solutions, offer other options, maybe a smaller place to daven, maybe ask and come up with some creative ideas. Sometimes there are fears of, like, if a child will miss a day of school because they're going to the cemetery, and it's like this fear suddenly of everyone will know. And, often as the adults in the room, we're looking at them like, do you really think nobody knows your parent died? But there's this anxiety of people will be talking about me. So sometimes that comes up and that can be normal. And we want to normalize it. And at the same time, we want to be able to give some coping mechanisms for the child to deal with that. There's a theory I call Yahrzeit Month. It has no research to it, but anecdotally, this is something I've seen, certainly with teens and children, but I see it with adults also. The concept that um, academic and behavioral changes will not happen the date of Yahrzeit. People expect that the date of is so emotional and stuff like that. I have noticed that it happens 2 weeks before, it begins 2 weeks before, and it can often end 2 weeks after the Yahrzeit. There's like this buildup of fear, of anxiety, of worry, of sadness, of missing the person, of not being able to ignore anymore that they're not in your life, um, leading up to the Yahrzeit. And then afterwards, depending on how the Yahrzeit went, sometimes people have a letdown, sometimes people have just an emotional release of like, wow, I feel exhausted now. All of this is normal. So if a school or a parent or a neighbor notices that there's some really big changes, I always say, no, if there's a Yahrzeit around the corner, that can often be the big factor here. Oops, I'm sorry. Gonna move. Here we go. These are just some ideas for family to do together, adults and children, or you can do it just with children. You can do it with an individual child. Family collage, those are great. I wish I had one here. I had one today as a sample. You can do it either on a poster board as a family, like all children and grandchildren together, where you just put a bunch of magazines. Children and teens can cut out words that speak to them about the deceased, and no judgment on what words they choose. And then just put it on any which way with Scotch tape, and there's no art skills needed. And it's just can be a really nice bonding activity as a family, or each kid can get their own 8.5 by 11 paper, and you just every child can present then what they've done. I actually had a family that had just prepared at every person's place a paper with the photo of the deceased in the center, and then everybody put their own words around it, and then they framed it, and everybody hung that in their room, and it was just something very special. Modeling clay, that's what I do with preschoolers or really young kids on Yahrzeit. A lot of times we'll take modeling clay and they'll make whatever scene they want to make. Sometimes they want to revisit, particularly if it's the first time, they want to revisit what was that funeral like for them. I want to just interject here and say that for a lot of people, the first anniversary of death this particular year is really re-experiencing what people didn't have in funerals and what people didn't have in shivas because of COVID. There was so little interaction that we were able to have with one another, so little support. And I think people are finding like we want to do something where we feel together with the people, where we notice that people remember our loved one. So it's something just to bear in mind that a lot of people are experiencing. You want to do creating your own stories. You can make your own storybook of a story that was meaningful in their interaction with the person who passed away. You can list interview questions before the Yahrzeit and have someone interview friends and family. And if you are a friend and family, this is a gift you're giving the children by being able to share stories about the deceased. You can create a photo book or a storybook, creating a pre-Yahrzeit album telling about what's coming up, really mitigate anxiety. Like first we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. And you can even insert pictures of the child. Do something on the Yahrzeit that carries meaning to the deceased. So often people say to me, what's a good idea for us to do or to give out or to sponsor? And I always say, what was the person like? What was something meaningful to them? You want to do something in that area. I do want to talk about the fact that although we're talking about anticipating the first anniversary of death, I do want to acknowledge that Yahrzeit for a lot of children who were really young when their parent passed away and maybe grieving now as adults. And I know some of you who are joining us maybe in your 40s, 50s, 60s and lost a parent as a child. Delayed grief is real. And you may have like an extra reaction sometimes on Yahrzeit, or you may be really numb from all the years of not being able to feel. Sometimes society looks at people and says like, what now? Why are you grieving? So I just want to acknowledge and say it's a really hard place to be, and it's very real, and it's okay. So I think that if there's one takeaway that I could just share before I hand it over to Dr. Blumenthal, who I'm very excited to hear from. I think it's that we want to give children and teens the space to be able to feel the full gamut of emotions. One of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves is the permission to feel whatever it is that we need to feel. And by doing that, we'll give our children and grandchildren and the children around us the permission to do the same. I'm going to hand it back to you, David.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Sarifka. I just had to unmute. It took me that additional second. I found it very important that you mentioned that there is no one way to grieve. We have many people joining us this evening, and those people represent just one person in every family member. And families may have 2 or 8 or 12 people in that family. And even within one family, I heard you say that people within the same family may grieve differently, and that's okay. Everyone needs to grieve in their own way. I also heard you say that people they missed the interactions during Shiva. They missed the stories, the personal stories of people coming. I know that the whole world was on Zoom and FaceTime and phone call, and sometimes people find it, uncomfortable or even a hassle to go pay a Shiva call. But for the people that are sitting Shiva, they love to hear the stories about the person who passed away, about the person who's sitting Shiva. Which brings me to Dr. Norman Blumenthal. Dr. Norman Blumenthal always comments in his conversations about trauma and grief on the importance of mentioning the person's name. Whoever passed away, it's not he or she, it's the person's name. Mention the person's name. That's how you keep that person alive. Dr. Norman Blumenthal is the executive chair of trauma and bereavement at OHEL. Dr. Blumenthal is in private practice. He's also the chair of the Wexner chair at REITs at Yeshiva University. It's really a pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, David, and thank all of you for attending. I often begin my presentations with a line that the rabbi at my synagogue used to deliver before his sermon, which is, before I speak, I want to say something. So before I speak, I want to say something. I want to thank OHEL, David, our CEO, David Mendel, our Presidium of Melzacht and Jay Kestenbaum for making it possible for us now for a full year to be able to provide these TheraZooms, and it's been really truly an honor to be a participant in that. And it's also a great privilege to share this podium, albeit remote, with Sarifka Cohn, who is the founder of Links, and Links has really made a huge contribution in terms of provision of bereavement services to our children, our very vulnerable children, and children who feel very isolated and misunderstood, and give them an opportunity to be together with other children who've experienced loss and to feel, for that period of time at least, normal and understood. I also want to commend and actually express mine and all of our gratitude to God that Lawrence, it is the anniversary of the survival of Lawrence Garboz, and commend both him and his wife Adina Lewis Garboz for their heroism, and not only in enduring what they had as one of the first people, certainly the first publicized case here in the Northeast, but also subsequently to lend assistance to others. We did a TheraZoom with them. It was particularly with Adina, and it really was one of the great contributions of this past year, and how grateful we are that they are doing well. And we wish the same for everybody from now on who is afflicted with this disease. I'd like to start, and my focus is going to be on adults. And I want to talk a little bit about just in general grief, and then talk about the Yahrzeit anniversary. And I'd like to begin by suggesting that there are 2 English expressions which I'd like to get rid of, at least when it comes to grief. And one of those expressions are being strong, and the other one is getting over it, which I hear all the time. In terms of strength, many of us seem to associate strength with stoicism, with being unemotional. a line I'll hear is, oh, he or she was so strong, they didn't cry, as if crying and expressing emotions are a sign of weakness. And nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, there are some people who by nature are sort of less emotional, maybe more stoic, and certainly nobody's suggesting that we have to try to become something that we're not, and some people are more emotionally expressive. But to look upon someone who is not overtly grieving or not in pain over the death of a loved one or death of a friend, especially during this extremely trying year, I think is a terrible misnomer and a terrible disservice. In fact, quite to the contrary. I'm going to propose to you that allowing their feelings to be expressed even after 1 year, even after 2 years, sometimes after multiple years, is actually a sign of strength. I remember, and for that matter, avoiding emotions is an act perhaps of cowardice and weakness. I remember a situation where I got a call from a woman whose young adult son died very suddenly. I think it was from an aneurysm, if I recall correctly. And it was still during what we refer to in Hebrew as the shloshim, the first 30 days from within the period of time that her son died. And she called me up and she said to me, Dr. Blumenthal, I'm so weak. She even said she was at her department store and she couldn't push the rotating door. And I said to her, that's because you're strong. And she seemed perplexed. She said, what do you mean? So I decided to give her a parable, to give her an example. I said, let's imagine the strongest person in the world. Let's imagine an Olympic weightlifter. And this Olympic weightlifter has muscles all over the place. This person eats steroids for breakfast, steroids for lunch, and steroids for supper. The single strongest person in the world. And he is about to break the world record for bench pressing, for weightlifting, let's say 1,100 pounds. And he's huffing and he's puffing and he's all red and the sweat is dripping all over him and his veins are popping out of his body. And with the last iota of strength that he has left, he lifts the thing, breaks the record, throws it on the floor and collapses from exhaustion. Is he strong or is he weak? I said to her, you're facing such a tremendous loss. You're facing something so painful. And it's making you weak, but you're facing it. And that is your sign of strength. And indeed, even as before I referenced crying, one of my favorite studies that I guess some of you have heard from me before, you may have heard my mentioning it almost every time I speak, but it's worth mentioning, was a study done a number of years ago in which a scientist decided to study tears. And he compared the tears that people cry from pain, the tears that so many of the listeners here have been crying over the past year, with the tears that you cry when you like cut onions or your eyes are just irritated. And they are totally different tears. The tears from pain have stress hormones in them. So that when you're crying, you're literally ridding the body of stress hormones, whereas the tears from cutting onions do not have those stress hormones in them. So there is something, as we know, is cathartic and health-inducing by crying. And the other term is that I really want to sort of address and maybe disavow people of is that the term that getting over it, that you're going to get over it. And yes, indeed, we do get over a mound of snow, and we in the Northeast just had a lot of snow, so some people did get over a mound of snow. It's possible that you can get over some minor setbacks, some of the nuisances and annoyances of life. If you purchase something and it turned out to be a poor purchase, it turned out to be a lemon, yes, you can get over it. But let me assure you that the absence of a loved one is not something that you just get over. It trivializes in a way and even sort of cheapens the significance of the relationships that we have and the profundity of the relationships that we have to think that we can get over it. And quite the contrary. There is such a thing as consolation, and it's beyond the scope of what I can speak about now in terms of what does happen, but just very quickly, consolation is not getting over it, consolation is not forgetting about the loved one, is just not feeling the pain when we think about the person who is no longer here. Consolation means that you have sufficiently worked it into who you are. You have woven it into your inner fabric that it doesn't assault you and hurt you to the same extent, but it's always there and you never quote unquote, get over the loss of a loved one. So let's talk quickly, and I do want to leave some time because there are many questions that have come in even during and before our presentation. I want to get a chance, I'll give a chance to the audience to raise more questions. Why do we have an anniversary of a death? Why do we have a yahrzeit? Why create a day in the calendar to recall something that's so painful? What's the purpose and function of this? I'm going to give you an example. Imagine on March 2nd, 2021, your roof leaks. Something that can happen, and it's terribly annoying, right? Now, the things get damaged, there's water damage, you have to hire a roofer and spend a fortune of money to have the leak fixed or the roof replaced. You have to repaint the parts of the house now that have water damage and water stains, and it's a very unpleasant experience. Now imagine when it's all done and the roofer comes to you with his exorbitant bill, and he says, by the way, I suggest that you mark in your calendar March 2nd, and from now on, every single March 2nd, you should recall what you went through this day when your roof leaked. I mean, what are you, crazy? Get it fixed, it's unpleasant, and put it behind you. Get over it. But why do we very specifically designate a day to go back to what might have been one of the most, if not the most painful day of our lives? And I want to propose two reasons that I think will make this commemoration of an anniversary meaningful. First of all, we're not going back to the pain. We're not recalling the pain, we're recalling the person. And the connection to the person is what's really important. I often tell people that when someone dies, the relationship doesn't end, it changes. It changes from a face-to-face relationship to an internalized relationship, to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. Thomas Attic, who's one of the top bereavement specialists, puts it very nicely. He describes grief of going from loving the person in the presence to loving the person in the absence. But that is in essence what grief is, and it's such an integral part of both respecting and honoring the deceased, but also helping oneself deal or integrate the grief is to keep the person alive, to keep the memory alive. And it's an opportunity, it's something people do all year, but it's an opportunity to sort of recharge the effort to have that person's memory preserved. By the way, that's the brilliance of Shiva and wakes and other commemorations, because if you do it right and you talk about the person, you're launching this whole process of shifting the relationship from a face-to-face relationship to an internalized relationship, a relationship where you think about the person, where you consult with the person, where you share memories. And this is so important, and it's so important to preserve the memory. And I dare say, particularly if the death of a young person, and a person who does not have a family left, and you want to make sure that that person's memory, because if it's even an infant death, you want that memory preserved. And therefore, we designate this day to generate more memories and to generate more lessons in life that we can carry with us through the day. But I also want to propose to you, and this may sound paradoxical and might be a little complicated, but I think it's important, that yes, we want the pain. We want to remember and keep some of the pain. Now, why do we want it? Pain is something we usually run away from. Why would we want to keep the pain? And I want to tell you something very interesting. I have gotten calls over the years from people. A lot of my work has been in parental grief, but even other widowhood and loss of a parent, where I've had people call up and say, I want more pain. I need the pain. I need the pain back. Pain is important. Why is the pain so important? And I think my own feeling is, and I haven't read this anywhere, but it's my own perception. You want to capture, what is there in our life that would capture the intensity, the profundity, the deepness, the intimacy of a relationship with a child, with a sibling, with a parent, with a spouse? What do we have if we want to, again, recapture that connection, that deep-seated, intense connection we feel with these people? And the closest thing is pain. And sometimes even recalling the pain is necessary to preserve the life, to preserve the memory of the person who died. So we do actually designate days so we can recapture and even rekindle the pain that we're going through. I want to conclude with a story. Pieces of it I'm going to tell in the vernacular, but in case people don't follow, I will definitely translate. And it's a story about a very famous rabbi in Jerusalem during the 50s, known affectionately as the Brisker Rav, as Rabbi Velvel Soloveitchik, who was really probably the leading rabbinic figure at that time in Israel, and who had lost a number of children during the Holocaust. And he pined for those children and mourned those children his entire life. And someone once came to him and said, Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's so many years already, and you're still crying and you're still paining over these children. Don't you have faith in God? Don't you believe that whatever God does is good? Why are you still in so much pain? And he answered in a very cryptic fashion. I'll say it in the original Hebrew, and then I'll explain what he meant. He turned to the guy and said, Bala marer lo yatsa. What happens is we're approaching the holiday of Passover. And Passover meal, as many of you may know, there are two foods. There are two foods that we eat that are essential, besides the 4 cups of wine, that are essential to the commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt. One of them is matzah, the unleavened bread, which captures the speed and alacrity with which the Jews left Egypt. And the other one is maror, the bitter herb, which is supposed to capture the pain and the bitterness of the slavery of the Jewish people in Egypt. And the Talmud asks the following question. It asks, what if you didn't ingest or just eat the matzah and the bitter herb? What if you just threw it down your throat, just crushed it up and threw the matzah down your throat, threw the bitter herb down your throat, and didn't chew it and allowed you to taste it as you ingested it? And the Talmud says for the commandment to eat matzah, you fulfilled. But the commandment to eat the bitter herb, the maror, you didn't fulfill, because you have to taste the bitterness. Now, our Passover Seder meal is not a sad occasion. It's not a mournful occasion. It's a celebratory, and it's one of joy. But in order to really have that joy, we have to taste also the bitterness. And I think the same is true about a yortzeit and about grief. To achieve consolation, to have the strength and the fortitude to go on and even celebrate the happy occasions in the future, we also have to taste the bitter herb. If you don't allow yourself to taste the bitterness, then you won't have capacity for the joy as well. And I thank you for listening. I wish all of you who have lost loved ones and friends, should have the full consolation and comfort from your loss. And I'm hoping that future webinars in the not too distant future will be on some topic other than the pandemic. Thank you.
Dr. Blumenthal, thank you very much. The story about Rabbi Soloveitchik is very powerful. And we also know the inverse of that story is what Moshe Feinstein Zatzal repeated, that there are times that you pay a shiva call and you say nothing. You just sit there and you say nothing. And you just cry. If you cry with the person who's sitting shiva, it's based on Vayidam Aaron, as you've often said. Aaron lost 2 sons, and he was quiet. You know, you mentioned Moror of Pesach, and we just left Purim a couple days ago, and the question is asked about Pasha Zocher. Why do we repeat Pasha Zocher every single year? In fact, we repeat it twice. For those who follow the weekly Pasha, we read it twice. One time to Shabbat before Purim. And it's explained that the reason that we say it, Pasha Zocher, is because 12 months after you lose a family member, 12 months after you lose a parent, and you say Kaddish, you are no longer obligated in the mitzvah of honoring your father and your mother, one of the 10 commandments. After 12 months, you're no longer obligated. It's good if you do it, but you're not obligated, because you tend to forget. You tend to forget the person who died 12 months ago. So the reason that we read Pasha Zocher is because we're obligated to remember what Amalek did to us. So we're obligated to read it once a year, thousands of years later. This conversation tonight is about taking upon ourselves that we want to remember, that it's hard to forget. As Sir Rivka Cohn and Dr. Norman Blumenthal spoke to us about. We have many questions and we have many participants that have submitted questions this evening. Let us get to a few questions. And I want to tell you, every single one is more complex than the next. Let me start with Dr. Blumenthal, because it's an adult asking the question about children. Dr. Blumenthal, we are grieving parents who lost a child, but are maybe expressing it in ways that are hard for our young grandchildren to understand. How do I deal with my own grief as an adult, as a grandparent, at losing a child or a sibling? I'm sorry, this is the sandwich generation question. My apologies.
Okay.
How do I deal with my own grief at losing a sibling, my parents' child, my sibling, while supporting my parents who are grieving and protecting my children, the grandchildren? It's a 3-generation question, Dr. Blumenthal.
Mhm. Okay, I guess since I'm living longer and exposed to more generations, that's why I'm the one who's having the opportunity to answer this question. One thing I will tell you about children. Children have a sixth sense for what's real and what's pretentious. They know, and they read their parents, their grandparents, they read adults like radar. They know them. And I think if we're genuine and we're open, there's nothing wrong with children seeing grief, especially today. Children today want to be, there was a period of time when we used to insulate children from painful experience inside, and the children were happy to be insulated. That's not in today's day and age of technology. Children want to know and children want to see everything. And real, genuine grief that is expressed can be explained to them and can be appreciated. I will tell you that we in the OHEL team, that was the most common question we got asked after if some of you may remember the Sassoon fire, the fire where 6 out of 7 children perished. And the most common question we got asked from community members and teachers was, can I cry in front of my children? Can I cry in front of my students? And the answer we gave them is you can't shriek and scream, but to see tears roll down your cheek as you talk about such an enormous tragedy is not only not harmful to the children, but it's educational. And that's what I alluded to before, that there is a strength and a capacity to express emotions. So sometimes you may have to tell children, I'm okay. I'm crying, but I'm okay. I may not be as cheerful, but I'm still attentive to you as children might be necessary. Actually, Sherry Mendel, who wrote that classic book, The Blessing of a Broken Heart, described a scene. I don't think it's in the book. I think it's something I heard from her directly. But shortly after her son was killed by a terrorist, she was walking with her then 6-year-old across the street and started to cry. And the 6-year-old was looking up to her, totally perplexed. And she said to her, Mommy has to cry now for 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, I'll be fine. She doesn't know how she did it, but exactly 30 seconds, she stopped crying. So I don't worry. Be real, be genuine. Let our children learn that parents, grandparents hurt and miss loved ones. And it's a tribute to the loved one that they're in so much pain.
Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal. So, Rivka Cohn, do you want to add anything about that? What this mom can tell her children about their grandparents?
Yeah, I think really Dr. Blumenthal said it all. I think there's a lot of modeling that we do in the way that we grieve, and the fact that we are okay with those emotions and that we're able to, like Dr. Blumenthal said, keep them somewhat in check to keep the safety of the kids there, but at the same time allow them to see that we have feelings and things affect us. It's such a healthy model for a child to see that they don't have to be afraid of that.
There are several questions about guilt. Each one is complex. Dr. Blumenthal.
Okay, yes, I noticed. I'm sorry.
The question is asked, how do I deal with my guilt that I could not be present when my husband, wife, mother, father died in the hospital and the nursing home? Everyone knows we couldn't be there They didn't allow us there. I wanted to be there so badly, but it's my guilt. I can't say to my dead spouse, well, they didn't let me in. How do I deal with that?
Okay, so I'll say two things, and then Rivka can maybe add to it. It's very important to understand guilt, that there's two types of guilt. I often refer to it as this guilt and this guilt. There's rational guilt and there's emotional guilt. Rational guilt is you really did something wrong. I mean, you forgot to lock the door and someone broke in and stole something. Then you can feel guilty. You should have been more careful. You might have said an inadvertent joke or something that turned out to be insulting to somebody, and you can, then.
Dr. Blumenthal, we lost you.
Yeah, you lost me. I'm sorry. I forgot to turn off my Bluetooth to my phone. Give me a second, and that won't happen again. Okay. So there are things you might do that really were responsive. And then there's situations which you really had no control over. And very often it centers around these kind of catastrophic situations such as death. And you still feel guilty, or what was described in this one would probably be referred to as survivor guilt, which is, why did I live and why did the other person die? Why aren't they here to enjoy parts of life that I can enjoy? And that's an emotional guilt. That's not rational. And what the mistake people make is they try to talk someone out of it. And you can't talk someone out of an emotion. So you can talk someone out of a rational guilt. I mean, if a person really said, I went to this doctor instead of that doctor, you can say, well, they're both top doctors. You didn't do anything wrong. But if it's an emotional guilt, you can't talk them out of it. And you can only be sympathetic because it's part of the expression of that pain. And just like, as you mentioned, David, crying with the person and hugging the person and just showing the person you love them, that's all you can do. You don't try to talk someone out of emotional guilt. The other thing, by the way, is, and here's probably a mistake as well, is that, well, I can't now ask for forgiveness for the person who died, that I couldn't be with them in the hospital. First of all, if you couldn't be with them, why you feel guilty? But again, that's an emotional guilt. But you can go to the cemetery and cry your eyes out and say to them, I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I want so badly to be with you. And because we can talk and we can communicate and we can connect with the deceased. It certainly fits if your belief system is such that you believe in the continued existence of the deceased. But even if it's an internalized person, you can have conversations, you can ask for forgiveness. And by the way, some of grief counseling, I mean, perhaps Rivka has had this experience as well, is actually literally going to the cemetery and having it out, having conversations with the deceased. So those are ways of addressing, as I said, the more emotional guilt.
Yeah,
Corollary.
it's not really fair, because I was nodding my head the whole time here, but I just will add to this last piece, because I think this is so vital. As much as I can before there is a death, particularly I saw a couple of questions also here about a parent with whom one didn't have a good relationship with. And I see that certainly with some children and teens, where either there was a fallout right before, there was a fight, and then shortly afterwards the parent passed, and then there's like, we left on such horrible terms, even if there was a loving relationship before. And sometimes, unfortunately, there really was a compromised parent. Like I saw a couple of questions that came in where there was a parent who just was not the parent that they should have been. And there's a lot of guilt about that unfinished business that we have going on for us. And that grief process, by the way, looks very different for those families. I think 100% this piece of having it out is huge. I know that I have had kids and teens who've written letters at home because they were afraid that when they came to the cemetery, they would freeze up. They've gotten to the cemetery and literally read from a paper so that they wouldn't forget what they really wanted to say. Sometimes they'll do that in therapy with the clinician, like do the actual writing in there where the therapist can help them with sometimes with prompts or help them where they get stuck or emotional or stuff like that. But really doing that can be hugely cathartic in terms of being able to say it. And, there's this mistaken belief in some parts of Judaism is that we can't speak negatively to the deceased. Right. So just to clarify that, going there for the purpose of trying to repair this relationship, there's nothing more golden in Judaism than that. And you just sit there and pour your heart out and say it like it is. And trust me, it's something that can be hugely, hugely cathartic. Sometimes, like I said, people will need space to do this, and this should be allowed to them. But it could be a really big help.
You used the word relationship and catharsis a few times, and I want to ask you a question. Before I do, I just want to mention to everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. This evening's Therazum is on the first anniversary of the first identified person in New York diagnosed with COVID. We don't have words to say to anyone who has lost a family member, who has lost a spouse, who has lost a child, who has lost a parent. The only words that we can say is Amakam Yenachem Eschem, whether that was 12 months ago or 8 months ago or 1 month ago, irrespective of the reason that they passed away, COVID, natural causes, anything that it was. So the purpose of this evening is to speak with you, to cry with you, to share information with you. In order to be able to do our work better, at the end of this conversation, we're going to ask all of you to please take a moment to complete an evaluation form so that we can continue to do our work better. Tonight may be the single most sensitive conversation we've had in a year. And we've done tens and scores of this. So please give us your feedback. So you spoke about relationships, you spoke about catharsis. A corollary is closure. There's a school of thought, especially after 9/11, so much was written about closure, that people can achieve closure, however each individual person does it. There's a school of thought that you never achieve closure. There's no right or wrong answer. We say, as I mentioned earlier, that after 12 months, you can move into another place, not move on. You move into another place. You can sit in your parents' chair if you didn't sit there for 12 months. You can go back to your seat in shul if you moved your chair. You're no longer obligated in the mitzvah of honor thy father and thy mother. So it's going into a different place. What's your message to people about closure? Is closure important? Is the word important? What are your thoughts, Ms. Cohn?
So it's a loaded question because I know it carries with it a lot of ramifications to people. For some, the word closure is a safety piece. They want to feel like at some point I'm not going to feel as badly as I feel now. Personally, I feel like grief is very, it comes in waves. And I don't think that we can put anywhere a definitive beginning, middle, and end to it. And for me, the word closure is stifling somewhat to the experience that the griever has. I think that putting kind of at end is deciding as an objective party that we can help another kind of achieve the ultimate in terms of they've processed the grief. And I think similar to what Dr. Blumenthal was speaking about earlier, it's really not, a lot of what we spoke about before this was that there's really not 5 stages of grief where you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're done. We don't check off boxes like that. And therefore, I think that the word closure, for me personally, I've seen it be very kind of stifling and very much about concretizing a process that I think is much more fluid than that. And so I would say that it's not so much about closure, similar to what you were saying, it's moving into different phases. We keep alluding to the fact that at the end of 12 months, we kind of move into a new phase, but Yartzeit, for argument's sake, continues for life, right? Even if a person's 40 years down the road, God expects that there's this one day that we need to be able to have this opportunity, kind of have the right to open up this painful place of loss and remember the person. And I love that line that you were saying, not remembering the pain, recalling the pain, but recalling the person, but being able to go there. So I think that closure for me indicates like sort of like this locked box and we're done. And I'd like to see it more as something that's a drawer that I may be opening sometimes, I may be closing it sometimes, and and kind of as also different, I think, moments come up, whether it's a wedding, a bar mitzvah, you know, when people make different events within a family, you know, a graduating college, people feel, again, this sense of loss oftentimes of, you know, we kind of would grieve in the future of each event. It's like, you know, where is this person and where would they have been in this? So that's kind of my view on it.
I like your drawer word. You know, we can put it into a drawer and we can take it out every once in a while, even look at it, but it doesn't define me. Dr. Blumenthal, an educator, is asking a question. One of their students lost a parent to COVID, and they want to know how they can be most supportive to a student, a young adult in the class, without it becoming the center of the conversation all the time. And the second part of that question, is there a different way to be supportive to a boy versus a girl adolescent student? Male versus female adolescent students?
Okay, all right. So the
You can do
yes,
the boy, and so Rivka Cohn can do the girl conversation.
okay, all right. Let me just. By the way, apropos, I love the draw concept as well. I remember one person once in a group who had already been a few years since the loss of her child, tried to describe to a more recently bereaved person what it was like now a few years later. And what she said was, I now carry my grief around me in a little basket. And when I need it, I reach in and take it out. So it's a similar idea of the draw. I think in terms of a young adult, or that matter, anyone who's suffering grief, no, first and foremost, nobody wants to be pitied. Whatever you do, pity sort of said, well, I'm up here and you're down here. And any kind of puppy eyes or any comment that sort of resembles pity is going to be resented. You have to impart your concern and care and love with dignity. And so sometimes even just, and by the way, I would tell you that perhaps sometimes what I have found to be most comforting, if you happen to know the person who the deceased, the died, let's say it's a young adult and it's a parent and you know something about the parent, wait about 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, and let him know, you know, I'm thinking about your mother, I'm thinking about your father. I remember how your mother and father handled that situation when you got in trouble, or how they this and that, and let them know that there's still, or even better if you can, something I learned from that person. And I try to impart that to people that I'm working with as well, that there was a life lesson. It doesn't have to be like my whole world changed, but some small way. The world is a better place now because of something I learned from you. I'll give you an example that's actually very poignant. I teach a bereavement course to the YU Smicha students. And we invite different people who have different kind of losses to address the students as they're studying psychology of bereavement. And I invited a woman who lost a baby who lived for about 3-4 weeks. And when at the end of the class, and it was a riveting presentation, really exposed the guys to that particular type of grief. And I said, you know, you're probably often wondering, what function did this child, I want to say the name because I want to preserve the anonymity, but what function did this child serve living just a few weeks? But you know what now? There's a caterer of future rabbis who are more sensitive to perinatal loss because of your child. And I said the child by name. So finding a way in which life has been enhanced by the person is a tremendous comfort. As far as male versus female, first of all, keep in mind that gender differences are being blurred more and more in our world. It's as we, as society at large, strives for more equality and undifferentiation. And even if you live in a more, let's say, traditional fundamentalist community, it may not be as impactful, but it does impact on us. So we're finding that gender differences are getting blurred. It is my impression that girls are more at home with their emotions, will be focused much more on the relationship. But again, those differences are not as stark as they used to be. I have also found, if we're talking about adolescence, that the if I have to go into a school after a death of a classmate or a young parent, I will get a little bit more from the boys, some of the what is called in philosophy theodicy, which is why do bad things happen to good people? Some of the sort of anger, how could a kind God do this to good people? I'll get that a little bit more from the boys and the girls, and from the girls I'll get much more of that empathizing, that connecting, that wanting to know what it felt like for that person to lose that loved one. So that's even some of that contagion. I'll get that much more from the girls, but I think as time goes on, we're going to see less and less of these kind of differences. Again, now I hand it over to my female counterpart for her version.
So I want to just go back first to the first part of the question, and then I'll address this gender piece. I think that in terms of when teachers ask me a lot of times these types of questions, I always refer to, I think it's Wolfelt, who coined the term companioning through grief, right? About really being the companion walking alongside the griever versus the front and back model or top, like I'm here and like sort of what you were saying in terms of the pity. But I think the word companion is the best way to put it, because a companion may do nothing other than walk alongside that person. And I think sometimes supporting the student looks nothing more than just simply being there, and people underestimate the power of what it's like when somebody is seriously with you and is present in the moment and feels with you in your pain. That kind of feeling is just ginormous. Just to speak to the differences in terms of gender, I do agree that we have a lot of things that have become blurred. I'm actually in the midst right now of planning our Bachram Shabbaton, which is next week. So in terms of programming, everybody said to us the first time we did a weekend for Bachram, I mean, for teenage boys, come on, girls talk, but what in the world, boys are not sharing their feelings about their loss and stuff like that. And I said, you know what, I think we need a different approach possibly. And so what we did was actually we created prompted questions similar to an Ungame style, if anybody's familiar, but sort of with questions. And I think that may just relate to the difference that maybe because the boys aren't necessarily typically used to this sort of conversation, but give them an opening and they're all there. They had horror stories of when they said the wrong words, when they were davening, when they were saying Kaddish or stuff like that. They had emotional reactions to different things that they've watched in their surviving parents and the likes. I think that we underestimate sometimes the power of how much a child or teen may want to share if we only give them the opportunity. And I just want to say something to what you said before, Dr. Blumenthal, about the 10 years down the line. So as I said at the beginning, I lost my mother when I was 9. I remember at 15 in high school, a teacher stopping me in the hallway and saying, I just want you to know I still make your mother's chocolate cake every Shabbos. And it was like this huge moment. And like you're saying, her life wasn't changed. I mean, chocolate cake does make your life better, but her life wasn't transformed in some deep way. But to me, that entire day, all I could hear was the statement of someone remembers, someone else didn't forget alongside me. And I think that if there's something we want to take, it's that there's something so important for grievers about keeping the memory alive of this person. This was a real person in their life, and this person had an impact, hopefully, on people around them. And like I said, back to referencing if somebody had a difficult relationship and stuff like that, that will be an additional layer of grief. But for those who had a wonderful relationship, they're going to want to hear more about how that person, and if I could say something, the lack of the proper shivas during COVID, the letters I got from kids was all around this. We didn't feel like other people got a chance to share with us just how meaningful this person was. So if you're here and you're listening and you had a neighbor, a friend, a cousin, a coworker, a colleague who died, take a moment, write an email to the family, send a message. Sometimes in written word, it's so much better because it can be shared and read and reread. Or if you feel more comfortable, give a call to the family and say, just want to tell you, it's a couple of weeks before the yard site. This is what I'm thinking of. And I'm remembering this conversation we had. And it can be just so meaningful.
I have the last question for the evening, and I saved the best. I think what I think is the best for last. And before I do, I just want to once again thank all of our participants and registrants for joining us this evening in a conversation on Beyond the Tears, anticipating the anniversary of loss Today is March 2nd, 2021. It is 365 days since the first person in New York was identified with COVID. He was profiled today in the Wall Street Journal. So you can look up the article on your own without me mentioning his name. He and his wife gave a riveting conversation. I also want to thank the UJA of Greater New York for joining us as a sponsor this evening. And please, after this TheraZoom, we will send you all an evaluation. Please take 1 minute to complete the evaluation so we can do our work better. Ms. Cohn, you mentioned walking alongside the griever. About 7 years ago, Dr. Blumenthal did a 2-minute video, YouTube, on the proper way to pay a shiva call. You know, what to ask, what not to ask. I've learned it from Rabbi Shmuel Weizmann about the proper way. I repeat it to everyone that I can, who, of course, repeated it from his Rebbe, Rav Palm Zatzal. So there's the reverse. I want to ask the question of the reverse. I call it well-meaning people who ask not well-meaning questions. You know, there are individuals that ask you the question, why aren't you crying? You're in Shiva. Why aren't you mourning? It's still Shloshim. Are you angry, so Rivka? Dr. Blumenthal, what happened in the hospital? What happened in the nursing home? Are you suing the doctor, so Rivka? And the questions abound. It's not people that are being mean or terrible. It's well-meaning people that are not understanding how to help you grieve properly. And of course, it's better that they don't say anything at all. Vayidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. So Rivka, what's your advice to people who cringe at these kind of questions?
Are we looking to advise the people who are going to pay a shiva call, or the people who are on the receiving end of these questions?
For this conversation, the people who are on the receiving end of the conversation, how they can respond.
So it's hard to say how to respond in the moment, because I think that for many of us, our gut reaction sometimes goes to the emotions that we'd like to avoid. But I will say two pieces: that going in sometimes knowing into certain circumstances that there will be these kinds of people, and that, like you said, they're well-meaning people who unfortunately are not sensitive enough and perhaps could benefit from watching that video by Dr. Blumenthal, which was excellent, by the way. I think that I recently sat Shiva for my father last year, I think it was. Right? We're already a year. And I remember going in and saying to myself, like, there are going to be people who are going to walk in this way, and what's going to be your reaction to them? And really, for me, I needed to just be in control of the environment. So the best I could, I was like the entertainer during Shiva, repeating the stories and soliciting from people, because the more that the griever has the capacity to be in the power of conversation. So if this is, let's say, a yard site where you're going to be meeting people who may be coming in, you can have a couple of lines that you can say so that that doesn't have a vacuum, because most of the time these well-meaning people will stick in their comments where there is a vacuum, where they sense that they're uncomfortable and they don't have what to say, and then boom, they end up saying the wrong thing. They don't usually come in planning to ask that question. It happens from that vacuum. So if you're able to, and this is not at all to put blame in any way on a griever who isn't or can't or whatever, but this is just a tool that I've seen work really effectively, is that if you're in any public function, if it's the first simcha after a death, anticipate that there will be these kinds of people. Come up with a couple of lines that you want to use when you see people. It's like, it's so good to see you. And yes, my father would have loved to have had you at this simcha. Thank you for joining us, and move on. If you don't leave that space, there's less of a chance for those comments to come. Now, what if they do come? What if they ask you, are you suing the hospital and stuff like that? try in whatever capacity that you have left. And trust me, it's not easy when you're in that grief-stricken moment and somebody catches you in this real vulnerable moment. Try to separate the question from the questioner and just answer in whatever line you're comfortable with. Come up with a one-liner and just say, you know, I don't believe in giving people information that you don't want to give them. And I don't believe in answering questions that you don't want to answer. But you can still remain polite, but yet assertive about the fact that this is a boundary I'm not crossing, right? So are you going to be suing the doctors? It's like, we're going to decide as a family what we're going to be doing. Boom, we just shut the conversation down. But we don't have to be nasty. We don't have to be biting. We don't have to turn into that just because. Now, do I fault a griever who turns to that? Do I think that as a community, our sensitivity can help matters? Sure. I'm just, like I asked before, you know, who are we speaking to? If we're speaking to the grievers, this can really help you set the boundary to the best that you can, and just realize that people, unfortunately, really don't know what to say.
Thank you very much. My answer would be, I would ignore the question and I would simply change the topic. And I would say, so Rivka, how are your grandchildren doing? How are your children doing?
Another
Just change-
effective tool.
Change the topic. And if they still don't get it, I'm so sorry I hear somebody calling me 2 miles away.
Mhm.
Dr. Blumenthal, you have the last word.
So first of all, I usually make it a custom to disagree with a co-panelist. I'm going to do that now. I actually found chocolate cake to be very expanding and broadening, so much so my doctor doesn't let me have any more of it. So I disagree with you as far as chocolate cake not being such a broadening experience. It has proven to be that way for me. In terms of the question about Shiva, I'm going to share 2/3. First of all, Shiva is for you, the mourner, not for the guests. And we have an aversion to being self-centered, to being self-serving. We pride ourselves with our altruism, but then times in life where you have to be selfish. And if there's a time in life where you have to be selfish, it's when you're grieving. And you steer the conversation, as was suggested both by Sarifka and by David, you steer the conversation in a way that is helpful to you. And that's helpful for you in terms of what I described before, that transition from a face-to-face relationship to a relationship of memories. I want to share with you my own personal experience with Shiva. I've been very fortunate that my first experience of Shiva, I was in my 60s for both parents. But I remember when I was first time I was sitting Shiva, and I was already working many years in the area of bereavement, I understood that it was necessary for me to go through this week to talk about my father and to share and to sort of organize the memories. But I didn't know why I have to say it in front of other people. I frankly thought I could sit down on the computer and write his biography. I could, talk to myself for that matter. Why is it necessary for other people to be present? And I came to realize many, but one of them was a very interesting experience that I had. When you live with someone and you know them intimately, there's a little bit of what we would call in psychology acclimation, what they call in the Talmud Nasik Heter. You take things for granted. And there were aspects of my parents' lives that I didn't think were anything special. And by the reaction of the audience, I came to realize that this was something special. I'll give a personal example. My mother's a Holocaust survivor, lost everything. My father was a refugee, but he came out with his family. My father was from German Jewish extraction, was a Yek. My mother was from a Hasidic family, very different cultures. When my parents got married, my father changed all our customs to be like my mother's because she lost everything. Even the songs we sang, the Zmirot we sang, were Hasidic. The only time I heard German melodies was when my grandfather came to us. And I thought everybody would do that. That's nothing special. I remember when I would tell people that, they were blown away. And I realized that this was something special. So I learned about my father from the response of the audience. So it's your Shiva, it's your grieving, and it's your loved one. And you can, and most of these responses were, as I mentioned earlier, are more based on ignorance. And I have to say that we're probably very lacking in how we educate people to conduct themselves during Shivas, during visiting the sick, how to treat others. But you can steer it in the direction, and it'll enrich the experience for the visitors and enrich the experience for yourself.
Thank you very much this evening on the Zoom of Beyond the Tears, anticipating the anniversary of loss. So Rivka Cohn, Dr. Norman Blumenthal. I want to thank David Leiptag for organizing this evening. For all of you who joined us this evening, we look forward to our next conversation, and we commit ourselves to transitioning the conversations from grief and loss and bereavement and anxiety and missed opportunities and unemployment and postpartum depression to somehow coming up with normal life after COVID. We need to have some conversations about returning, coming back, being normal, whatever that definition is to anyone. Thank you very much, everyone. Please complete the evaluation form that you're about to get. Good night,
Good
and
night.
thank you. Be safe.